Hi guys, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. So, a topic that I have got asked a lot about over the last few years, that I've been making, a couple of years that I've been making videos, is the question of sword and shield. And the main thing people want to know is where they can find sources or manuals for studying sword and shield, but also what my views are on sword and shield. Well, I will try to keep this. It is a massive topic, and so I'll have to make numerous videos about this in the future. But this is essentially a video to set the scene, I suppose, set the basic, the very big picture context, so that I can revisit specific aspects of the topic in future videos. First up, there are no early period sword and shield treatises, unfortunately, and there are no real detailed descriptions of how a sword and a shield were used together, okay, until you get into the 15th century. So, in terms of early medieval, like the Viking era sword and shield I'm holding here, in terms of the early medieval sword and shield stuff, it is all pure reconstruction and essentially what I would term, rather than strictly speaking pure historical fencing, in other words studying a historical fencing treatise and just doing it, to how it's described and practising it until you get good at it, rather than pure historical fencing, it is actually verging on experimental archaeology. That is, taking the fairly minimal set of facts that we know the statistics of the swords and the shields, and we've got some pictures of them in use, and we've got some saga type description of them in use, descriptive accounts of them in use, but not very detailed. And we've got later period sources, and I'll come back to this point in a minute. We've got later period sources that use two weapons that we can maybe inform earlier period stuff with. This is really all we've got to go on. Now, there are a number of people around the world, particularly in Europe, I have to say. I'm not that aware of any people really leading it in America at the moment, but in Europe we've got a couple of people who've really been working on particularly Viking era sword and shield for a long time. The first one, who I'm sure will be known to many of you, is Roland Vorcheka, who I know from numerous events over the years, and he's a very nice guy. He has a Facebook page, which if you're on Facebook I highly recommend you like and follow, which is called Dimikator. I'm imagining how a German might pronounce it, Dimikator, I would imagine an American would say it, but I'll put the link underneath this, under this video. And the other person who's worked a lot with Viking era weapon combinations, including of course sword and shield, is Colin Richards. Now, they do both have contrasting interpretations. That is not surprising, because we don't have any real sources to go on. And this is really the topic of this video, is that really you are working on, when you're working with these type of weapon sets that you don't have explicit treatises for, you're really in the kind of we'll never really know territory. And that's not a bad thing. The good side of that is that you've got to apply your brain a little bit more creatively. You've got to refer to many different sources. You don't have the easy option of just reading the manual, and you've got to have almost a more holistic and kind of wider view of martial arts and how weapons should be used. However, the downside is, firstly, you'll never really know whether you've got it right or not, and secondly, you're very likely to come up with a very different interpretation from someone else who might have a completely equally valid interpretation, and you come to completely different conclusions, and that can unfortunately create conflict, which is not necessarily necessary, and that's another point of this video. So, what sources are there that we can look at, what actual technical sources are that we can look at for sword and shield combat? Well, first of all, if you're interested in 16th century sword and shield, you're in luck, because there are a range of particularly Italian sword and shield sources. For example, Marozzo from 1536 and Manciolino from 1531. In Bolognese, which is the tradition of Bologna. In Bolognese fencing, that both Morozzo and Manciolino are part of, and in fact two of the earliest authors of, there was a very strong tradition of both sword and buckler and sword and shield use. Now, the sword and shield sections of Morozzo and Manciolino are not big. They don't give you an awful lot to work on, however they do give you something to work on, which is fantastic, that's great. However, remember that the type of shield that they're using is really quite different to a boss-held Viking shield, for example. They're using what's called a rotella. A rotella, sometimes known as rondash in arms and armour books for some reason, a rotella is essentially a domed, round shield. It looks a little bit like a hoplite shield, and in fact might have had its inspiration in classical sources, because of course in 16th century Italy they loved anything that was Greek or Roman. And the rotella is strapped to the arm, like a heater shield is. It's strapped to the arm, it's round and it's domed. So it's very different to the Viking shield. The Viking shield is held in the hand like a buckler and it's flat, okay? Which completely changes how you would use the shield in general. Not only that, but of course it's a different period. The 16th century is very different to the 9th or 10th century. Okay, so if we're trying to reconstruct Viking martial arts, yes, it may be very useful to look at a 16th century Bolognese source. However, it might be that the way that they use a strapped domed shield is utterly different to how someone in the 9th century would have used a boss-held flat shield. So that's the next thing. The periods are completely different. If for example, we wanted to reconstruct the way that an arming sword was used in the 14th century, which we sort of know, okay, we sort of know how arming swords were used in the 14th century thanks to Fiore and the German, some of the German sources. If we wanted to reconstruct 14th century arming sword and we looked at 16th century side sword, which are similar weapons, if we just copied Morozzo's side sword, we wouldn't get something that was very similar to 14th century arming sword, unfortunately. It is similar, and you can certainly see, when you've got both sources there to compare, you can certainly see the similarities, but you can also see the differences. And if we just picked up a medieval arming sword, a 14th century arming sword, and used it like a 16th century side sword, then you'd actually be doing something quite different. So the problem is, even if the weapons are the same, then sometimes the system changes because of context changes. Next up, the weapons themselves can be superficially similar, but actually be quite different. So there are some fundamental differences with swords in the 16th century in terms of hand protection. And the fact that you start to have knuckle bows and finger rings really quite changes how it is, generally speaking, safe to use a sword. Obviously it becomes safer to have the hand further forward because you've got things protecting the hand. A medieval arming sword, or of course a Viking era sword, not really safe to do that because you've got your hand chopped off. Okay, so actually, if you were looking to use a medieval arming sword by itself, you'd be best looking at the medieval arming sword sources or the Messer sources, because they're from the same period and have a weapon which has similar considerations. Not all the same though. Messer is not used exactly the same as an arming sword, but it's used in a similar way. So there's all sorts of minefield with using what we often term in HEMA frog DNA, and this is a reference to the film Jurassic Park, where of course they use frog DNA to reconstruct dinosaurs, and what they end up with aren't actually really dinosaurs. They look like dinosaurs, but they can change their gender. Okay? Now that's science fiction, however it's a good analogy for our purpose, because if you use frog DNA, the problem is you've got frog DNA, and it might enable you to recreate something, but you're not actually really recreating something. You're recreating 95% of it, hopefully, but you'll always have 5% that's different. And in fact, you might have a bigger percent or a more important percentage, should we say. It might be that final 5% that's really, really important. So it's always a minefield using later sources. So we've got the Bolognese sources, we've got some other Italian sources that use rapier and shield, but of course the rapier is even more different from a medieval type sword, medieval cut and thrust sword, than a side sword is. So generally speaking, the rapier and shield sources are even more different, probably, from how these might be used than the Bolognese, rotella and side sword. But if we go back into the 15th century, we do in fact have a series of sources that are in German treatises from the 15th century that deal with the use of the so-called dueling shield with either a sword or a club. Now the dueling shield is called that essentially because it was part of the weapon set that was given to commoners, not knights, to commoners to fight judicial combat. That is, if I was accused of sleeping with my brother's wife and I disputed that and I got into a fight with my brother about it, we went to court and the judge decided, okay, well I can't tell which of you is right, and my brother said, I want trial by combat, and I said, I agree. We might be granted the right to decide it under the eyes of God, under the eyes of God, to decide who is right and who is just, who's lying and who's telling the truth, essentially. And in some cases, and trial by combat was actually historically very rare. Okay, that's the first thing. I might do a video just about trial by combat in the future, but it didn't happen very often. However, the treatises that deal with fencing, particularly in Germany, actually pretty much only in Germany, loved to talk about trial by combat. I guess it was a bit fetishised. They thought it was pretty interesting, pretty funky, and it involved some interesting weapons, and so the fencing masters making books thought, yeah, I want to make a book about that, because that'll be an extra thing that'll look pretty funky in my treatise and show the variety of things I can teach and the reason that people should pay me lots of money to teach them. Of course, not that many commoners would be able to afford to pay for a fencing master at that period, but anyway, it was interesting stuff, so they put it in their treatise. Now the dueling shield is very long, it's very tall, it's usually about as tall as a person, and it has a pole all the way down the back, and then that you hold pretty much like a boss-held shield, and then a large board. Okay, and if you just Google Talhofer dueling shield, then you'll immediately see loads of examples on Google Images, for example. Now the dueling shield is big and it's heavy, and very often what you see is the combat starts with the big dueling shield and the sword or a club. It depends whether you're, I think, in Swabia or Franconia or something. Whether you get the club or the sword depends which part of Germany you're in, essentially. But you start off with the shield and the sword or the club, and they show techniques using the dueling shield with the weapon. They also then show techniques where the weapon's being dropped or abandoned and the person's using their shield entirely as a weapon. Now remember that this thing is 6 foot long, it's got a pole down the centre and has spikes on it, top and bottom and on the sides in some cases. So you can use the whole thing as a great big two-handed kind of cumbersome pole weapon. Let's ignore that bit for a minute. Those fights start off with sword and shield or club and shield. That means that they're showing techniques that use a sword or a club in conjunction with a boss-held shield. And this has been one of the primary sources that people have gone to try and reconstruct early Viking era sword or club combat with a shield. Because mechanically, the boss-held or centre-held dueling shield is somewhat similar to a boss-held Viking shield in that it can pivot. Okay? However, it's also pretty damn different. It can defend your legs without having to move very much because it goes all the way down to the floor like a kite shield. It also goes up as well. You don't ever have to really move the shield up here. You can hold it in the middle and it protects everything from above your head right the way down to the floor. It's also very heavy and cumbersome. That means that a lot of the time what the people are doing is they're pivoting the shield and fighting around it. Bam! They're doing this type of thing a lot. Okay? So they're pivoting this really big shield because it's fairly big but it's also fairly slow, and in that time you can actually move the body around it like this. Okay? Now, it is a great source for trying to reconstruct shield and sword use. However, how similar is it to anything that came earlier? Essentially we don't know. Okay? And so that's the main point of this video. We have a handful of later medieval, in other words 15th century German, 16th century Italian sword and shield sources that we can look at to try and reconstruct earlier stuff. The other thing to mention, of course, is we have sword and buckler. We have a lot of sword and buckler material, and many people would argue that actually our main source for knowledge about how a shield and a sword are used together is the sword and buckler material, and a lot of people who've worked with the earliest medieval fencing treatise, which is I-33, sword and buckler, make that argument, possibly completely validly, that you can reverse engineer a lot of what's shown in I-33 to the use of larger shields with a sword. That might be correct. Again, we just don't know. However, the problem with it is, number one, a buckler is very different to a shield because it's a completely different size. Okay, that introduces all sorts of different factors. There's a factor of weight, there's a factor of angulation and size, mechanics. You know, pushing an opponent's shield is very clearly, obviously, mechanically important. Pushing a buckler doesn't really get you very far usually. It's just a buckler is a very different thing to a larger shield. But there is yet another problem with it, in that there isn't only one way of using a sword and buckler. If we look at I-33 and then we look at Marozzo, okay, so we look at a 14th century German source and we look at a 16th century Italian source, you know what, they have fairly different ways of using the sword and buckler. And in fact, if we look at some of the 15th century German stuff, some of that looks quite different to I-33 as well. So it seems like sword and buckler, which was probably the most popular civilian sidearm set for the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, varied quite a bit. It varied by teacher, by area, by perhaps buckler type. If we look at the Bolognese traditions, we see that they use both small round bucklers and larger squarer bucklers, which are corrugated to potentially bind against an opponent's blade better. And there are even Hungarian type bucklers, which are shown in Paulus Cal, which go down the forearm and have a kind of spiky bit on them. So there's a lot of variety. It's very different, and there are different techniques. I mean, as I mentioned, the Bolognese treatises even have different sections for square buckler versus round buckler. That's not to say they're completely different, but they have different techniques depending on whether one's slightly bigger and squarer than the other one. So man, it is a minefield. It is relatively easy to reconstruct lost or forgotten martial arts where we have a book, where we have a treatise telling us how to do basic things, how to step, how to cut, you know, the different angles of the cut, the different portions of the blade you can cut with, and the different types of thrusts and the different angles of thrusts. These are all things that are contained in I-33, which is the earliest sword and buckler source, or Dobringer or Fiore de Liberi, which are the earliest longsword sources, or indeed for dagger as well, certainly in Fiore. So by 1400 we actually know a shed load about how to use longswords, sword and buckler, dagger, medieval wrestling, because we've got it described explicitly in the books. Anything that's not described explicitly in the treatises is always going to be a real uphill struggle of trying to pull together different sources and put them together in a way that might work with the different weapon set in a different time period with different perhaps considerations about combat. Very, very difficult to do. But I want to finish by saying the people who are leading this research into old, undocumented essentially shield and sword or shield and spear, old undocumented fighting systems, which were obviously very developed in their own time. Those guys, Roland Vorcheka, Colin Richards, you know, Thrand and Elgrim, and various other people who are out there, but there's particularly a few groups in Germany and the Netherlands working on this stuff, and I know at least one in Italy as well, and in France also. Those guys, all of you, you have my utmost admiration. I don't want you to take this video in any way as a negative thing. This is a video intended for the mass of people who maybe don't know that much about HEMA and who assume that we have documented systems for all of the different weapon sets, which we don't. It's relatively easy to take one rapier treatise, Salvatore Fabrice for example, and learn his rapier system, especially obviously if you have a good teacher to go to. It's relatively easy to pick an Italian or German longsword system and learn it from the book, with some help, with some partners and so on. It is really, really difficult to come up with plausible systems using weapons where we don't have documentation, detailed technical documentation for what they actually did with them and how they actually fought. And inevitably we will all come up with slightly differing interpretations because we've got so little material to work on. But those of you guys out there, particularly Roland Vorchacker, I have to say, have my utmost admiration, and I'm very interested in this topic, and I will hopefully learn lots from all of you in coming years. But it is a difficult task, and I don't want anyone out there to underestimate what the guys like Roland and Colin and others out there, what those guys are doing. What they're doing is very, very difficult, and it's far more difficult for them to make convincing reconstructions to convince other HEMA people like me, who study the documented systems pretty much mostly or only. It's very difficult for them to make or recreate convincing systems that convince us. Okay, so you should respect those guys a lot. So there we go, guys. I'm sure I'll talk a lot more about generally sword and shield and spear and shield combat and shields in general in future videos. But really, respect goes out to the guys working with these essentially undocumented systems and trying to bring them back. Cheers, guys.